Well, I'm Dominick DellaSala. I'm the Chief Scientist and the President for the National Center for Conservation Science and Policy here in Ashland, Oregon. And I arrived on the scene back in 1998. I had been part of a team of scientists at the time at the World Wildlife Fund, and we finished a continental assessment of biodiversity in the U.S. and Canada, and the Klamath-Siskiyou ecoregion, which we're in now, jumped out as significant on a global scale. This region is important for a lot of reasons, and the Siskiyou Crest is the land bridge. It's the crossroads, the biological crossroads of the coming together of a lot of different plant communities in a big melting pot that sits up here on the crest and is hanging together because of what's left in the roadless areas and the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, and in places that are still in good shape, supporting the region's globally outstanding biodiversity. Well, at the National Center for Conservation Science and Policy, the organization's been focused mostly on looking at the local and regional impacts of climate change. And what we're mostly concerned about is mitigating for the effects of climate change and preparing for those adverse consequences that are going to kick in no matter what we do. So our programs are mostly focused on those two objectives. And in the case of the Rogue Valley and the Klamath-Siskiyou bioregion in general, what we've done is we've taken global climate change projections and we've applied them to the local region. And what those projections are telling us is that over the course of as little as 3 or 4 decades, we're going to see some pretty dramatic changes in this region. And down lower in the lower elevations, we're expected to see a quite significant increase in the temperatures, as much as 15 degrees Fahrenheit during the summertime by the mid to later portion of the century. We're already experiencing declines in our snowpack. Across the western United States, snowpack is declining at a fairly regular pace. And as snowpack declines, we lose our water supply. And the reason why the Siskiyou Crest is so important, because it sits at that biological crossroads that is not only important from a biodiversity standpoint, but it's holding together the integrity of watersheds that are key to downstream users, particularly the city of Ashland. Over 20,000 residents draw their water supply from the Ashland watersheds. And the highest and best use of those watersheds is to protect them, particularly as the climate shifts and we lose our snowpack. Water is going to become increasingly important and is going to become a limiting factor on growth in the valley. Now, the other objective that we're quite concerned about is the mitigation side of it. We all have to reduce our greenhouse gas pollution, and that comes down to how we're using energy and also how we are doing land practices across the region. And when you look globally at the sources of greenhouse gas pollutants, one of the big contributing factors is deforestation globally. It's second only to the world's entire transportation system. So in terms of releases of carbon dioxide, it's right up there with all our fossil fuel use. And so the good news is that we can do something about that. And we can manage these forests as a carbon sponge. And particularly in the Northwest, these forests soak up more carbon than most ecosystems on the planet. They are the carbon champions in the world, and their highest and best use ought to be set aside as a carbon trust for the nation to deal with the growing threat of climate change. And every time we log those forests, up to 40% of the carbon is released as CO2 into the atmosphere, where it contributes to the global problem that we have with the climate warming. And if we set aside these forests as a carbon trust, we get the dual value of having them set up to absorb a good chunk of our carbon dioxide releases and also protecting our water supply. And that's what I think the highest and best use of this landscape is, because it's so centrally located as the land bridge, the biological crossroads. There are old forests up here, there are intact watersheds, there's water, drinking water supply. That's what you do when you're facing the coming perfect climate storm that we're going to be hitting here pretty soon. Start early and apply as much education and pressure as you can. because it's going to take a really significant investment in education to decision makers about the importance of places like this. And when we worked on the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, it's a very important part of that land bridge. It's about 53,000 acres in size, but it's only one significant piece. If you look at the complex of roadless areas that are part of this Siskiyou crest, if you look at those as a whole, that landscape as a whole needs to be protected for its biodiversity crossroads function. And the roadless area is essential in that. And especially when our climate is changing, we're going to see climate-forced migrations of wildlife. Typically, what the projections are showing is that we're going to see a movement up in elevation and up in latitude. And a lot of these roadless areas are at the upper elevation end of the mountain landscape. And so a solid climate change strategy is to look at this landscape as a climate refuge. And I think that word needs to get out, building on what we did with the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, which was a monument to biodiversity. Now what I think we need to do is have a monument to a climate refuge, because we're all going to need this landscape as the climate shifts for not only our wildlife values, but for our drinking water. So this really should be a monument to climate change. You know, if I have to borrow on the work that was done on the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, it started early. It took a lot of effort and many years and a lot of dedicated conservationists to get that through as a national monument. And I guess the take-home message in terms of getting the Siskiyou crest protected as a monument is that we know that there's an incredible amount of interest on the part of the public right now on climate change. We know that the Obama administration has taken climate change very seriously, a lot more serious than it's ever been taken before. And so I think that the combination of interest in the subject of climate change on the part of the public and the part of the decision makers is an entry point for discussing this region to be set aside as a climate refuge. And I would start working it now and making sure that as the Obama administration formulates its national policy on climate change, that they are approached to set aside old-growth forest in the Pacific Northwest as part of the nation's carbon trust, and also to protect our intact roadless landscapes as part of a climate refuge. And the more you can deliver that message of these areas are key to not only the wildlife diversity of a region, but to our own survival, because they contain our drinking water supply and a lot of the ecosystem services that we depend on in a changing climate, the better your message will resonate with decision makers and the public.